armies can be massive. But just how massive are the armies of the past, and how do they compare to the newest armies? Today's video is going to cover everything you need to know about army sizes throughout history. Most modern armies, much like ancient armies, are comprised of a series of professional soldiers and reservists who can be called upon when required. For today's video, we'll be looking at the combined total, and the earliest figures used within this video are estimates from historians, ancient writings, and from research into the greatest empires and countries to grace this planet. Our first trip will take us on the road to 1200 BC, where we see the first great army raising over 100,000 soldiers. It was, of course, none other than the Egyptian army, led by Ramses II the Great. During the three great successful Syrian campaigns of his reign, such a force was really important in reclaiming the sphere of influence that had been lost by the Egyptians over the prior century. Violence isn't always the best way of influencing people, but the Egyptians soon learnt that it's a very effective one. Furthermore, considering that the world population at this time was only 50 million, forming such an army meant 1 in 200 people globally were within its ranks. All good things must come to an end, however, and with the death of Ramses II and the gradual decline of the Egyptian Empire, other armies would rise in their place. The first army to take up the mantle and surpass this Egyptian army was that of the Neo-Assyrians, located in modern-day Iraq and Iran. Their army would peak between 750 and 700 BC with a total of 200,000. An army of this size was required during the expansion of the Neo-Assyrian Empire, which would double in size under the prosperous reign of Tiglath-Pileser III, who would successfully dominate the Levant, now known as the Eastern Mediterranean, and its adjacent surrounding area, and famously led the conquest of Babylonia. The Great Persian Empire in 500 BC crushed the prior record by the Assyrians with an impressive display of 500,000 soldiers under the hand of the famous King Darius I. Darius I, or otherwise known as Darius the Great, was a Persian ruler who effectively reigned from 522 BC until his death in 486 BC. King Darius would reign at the peak of the Persian Empire when it was at its maximum, when it included much of Western Asia, Balkans, Caucasus, most of the Black Seas region, Central Asia and the Indus Valley in the Far East, portions of North Africa, Northeast Africa, Egypt, Eastern Libya and coastal Sudan. The West would dominate battlefields with masses of soldiers during early history, but this was about to all change in 300 BC with the rise of the first Great Eastern Army in the form of the Maya Empire, located in modern-day India and Pakistan, which would match the Persian Empire at 500,000 soldiers. A period of stagnation occurred in the next 700 years, and it would take until 400 AD that Western civilization levied an army over 400,000, with the Roman army reaching its peak. This was just 0.13% of the world population at the time, 4 times lower than that of the Persian Empire. Much like the soldiers of Rome, time marched on, and 200 years passed. An army sprawling from modern-day eastern and central China reached a staggering 650,000 soldiers. This army was raised by the Sui Dynasty, famed for their progressive policies and for beginning the major public works projects of the Great Wall and Great Canal. It was the Eastern armies that continued to break records as the growth of the Song Dynasty began. This Chinese dynasty toppled the 650,000 soldiers of the Sui Dynasty from the top by over 200,000 additional soldiers, equaling 1 in 500 people within the world at the time. Over the next 300 years, the Song Dynasty faded and a new great force began, originating from the sparse lands of Mongolia. This Mongolian force, united by the great Khan Genghis, would be the first army to reach approximately 1 million soldiers. Mobilised from the Great Plains and would dominate Europe and Eastern battlefields over and over, handing defeat to those who would challenge them. although not directly challenged, the top spot would be poached just 100 years later by the Ming Dynasty, reaching 1.15 million soldiers in its rank and increasing to over 1.3 million in the 100 years following. An additional 300 years would pass for any army to rival this size, and it would come in the form of the French Revolutionary Army in the 1800s, led by none other than our favourite completely average height Napoleon. This army would reach over 2.5 million total soldiers in his force, nearly double that of the Ming Dynasty. By this time, however, the world population had reached over 1 billion, and so resulted in just 1 in 400 people being part of the French army. Army sizes grew, shrank, and grew again up until the fateful assassination of one Archduke Franz Ferdinand 114 years later, signalling the beginning of World War I. This, of course, broke Napoleon's revolutionary French force record for the first time and would come in the form of the German army. The German army would equal over 4.5 million soldiers at the beginning of the war and would rise to 5.3 million by the end of the war. For scaling purposes, world population at this point was about 1.8 billion. It wouldn't take long for forces of this size to re-emerge, and it would come from the heart of Germany once again during World War II and the reunification of the German army under Hitler. The force of Hitler's army is estimated to have reached over 6.5 million people in June of 1940, nearly doubling to over 12 million by June of 1944. This force was, of course, rivalled by both the Soviet Union and the United States at approximately 11 million and 12 million respectively at the end of the war in 1945. The following 5 years after the end of the war, coming up to 1950, the armies of both the United States and the Soviet Union were cut by approximately 90% when the end of conscription occurred, and the largest army was that of the People's Republic of China with over 6 million. No armies have ever reached the scales of that shown in World War II, and we hope they won't ever again. However, given that we have showcased the sizes of the biggest armies of all time, let's showcase how today's armies stack up. The largest army of 2022, in terms of pure manpower, is attributed to North Korea, yielding a total army including paramilitary groups, a term used for unofficial soldiers / military groups, of around 7.8 million, equivalent to 0.1% of the world population. Rivaled closely by South Korea with a total of 6.7 million, followed swiftly by Vietnam, India and the People's Republic of China with 5.5, 5.1 and 4 million respectively. Although army sizes are not as proportionally large as they used to be, it is likely down to inventions such as unmanned aircraft, advancements of mechanised infantry, missiles, and the list goes on. These figures are very hard to comprehend, but we hope that this video has given you a graphical insight into the growth of armies throughout history, and much like the armies of old, we too on this channel are trying to improve and grow, so help us by checking out some of the other videos on this channel, and of course subscribe if you are interested. Although this video has showcased the pure manpower of some of these armies, it doesn't necessarily mean that these armies are the most powerful within the world at the current time. As such, we would like you to join us in our deep dive into the power of weapons of war used throughout history in the next video coming soon on the channel. Check out our previous video on the power of nuclear weapons in the meantime. Hope you enjoyed, and I'll see you soon. Goodbye.